with the kind of Kantian move in philosophy. Citizenship is simply an arbitrary fact conferred on individuals through the accident of birth. But since birthright citizenship is an artifact of what you might call a pure sort of genetic lottery, there are no moral or special obligations attached to it. The Kantian emphasis on universality, that is to say that there is a moral law that can be universalized and held to be true for all human beings, stressed for Kant that we are all parts of what he called a kingdom of ends, a universal kingdom of ends, where every individual is due equal moral value and respect because simply of their humanity alone. That idea of a cosmopolitan ethic of humanity, Kant believed, could only be realized in a republican form of government, today what we might call a democracy. Or, to speak more precisely, what Kant believed, it could only hold true in a confederation of republics overseen or ruled by international law. Kant was perhaps, I don't know if he was the first, but he gave the most powerful early expression to the idea of a League of Nations that would put an end to war altogether between states for the sake of achieving what he called perpetual peace, the title of a famous essay of his. Hobbes and Locke, he believed, were wrong in attributing sovereignty, absolute sovereignty, to the individual nation-state. For Kant, the state, the individual state, is merely a kind of developmental stage along the path to a world republic of states organized around the idea of international law and peace. Only in, he believed, a league of republics would peace among the nations finally be realized, and would individuals be able to treat one another as ends rather than means. If you want just some indication of how influential Kant's view has been, you can think that his idea for an international League of Nations came to fruition over a century after his life in Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points, issued after the First World War and elaborated more fully in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, all of which bear the unmistakable imprint of Immanuel Kant. Now, neither of these views, let me argue, either of these views, Schmitt's or Kant's, really captures the nature of the political. Let me start with, adequately so at least, let me start with, return to Schmitt again. Schmitt's view is rooted, I believe, in a very important human truth, namely the world is a dangerous, in fact, very dangerous place. Like in many ways Hobbes or Machiavelli, Schmitt takes the extreme situation, that is to say the situation of war and mobilization for war, and turns it into the norm, turns it into the normal situation. An extreme situation is one where the very survival, in fact the very independence of society is at stake. And for Schmitt, every situation is potentially a life and death struggle against a kind of existential enemy where one must decide to choose up sides between friends and enemy. Politics, for him, is a kind of endless struggle for power guided by national self-interest alone. And yet, it would seem to me, a politics of unremitting war and preparation for war would have to be self-defeating, even in Schmitt's own terms. For example, why should the struggle between friend and enemy be exclusively what we might call an interstate rivalry? Wouldn't competition between individuals and groups just as easily become a feature of domestic politics as well? Why is war something that takes place exclusively between states rather than within them? is the logic of bitter rivalry and competition and friend and enemy cuts all the way down, so to speak. The logic of Schmitt's argument, at least as I understand it, points not only to war between states, but ongoing civil war and civil conflicts within states, between rival groups expressing their own desire for power and their own loyalty to their individual groups. The result of this logic of conflict, it seems to me, would be the negation of politics. That is to say, the destruction of the sovereign state as the locus of political power. Why should, again, the choice of friend and enemy be a choice between states rather than individuals? But let me then turn to Kant's view, cosmopolitanism, because if the effect of Schmitt's distinction between friend and enemy is to make politics identical with war, the effect of Kantian cosmopolitanism is to confuse politics with morality. Kant and his present-day followers wish to transcend the sovereign state and replace it with known international rules of justice. If Schmitt believed that man is the dangerous animal, Kant believes man is simply the rule-following animal. But Kant's desire, it seems to me, to transcend the state with a kind of international forum is both naive and anti-political. If Hobbes was right when he said that covenants without the sword are but words, the question is who will enforce these international norms of justice? Kant's conception of a kind of global justice is to wish a world without states, a world without boundaries, a world, in short, without politics. International bodies like the United Nations have been notoriously ineffective in curbing or restraining the aggressive behavior of states, and international courts of justice like that in The Hague have been highly selective in what they choose to condemn. It would seem that reliance on such bodies would have the further disadvantage of uprooting people from their traditions, from their local arrangements that most people find as a source of reverence or awe. There seems to be little room for reverence in the sacred in the cosmopolitan ideal. The logic of this view, the logic of Kant's view for perpetual peace, necessarily leads to a world state, world government. Even Kant admitted that a world state would be what he called a soulless despotism. He was opposed to the idea of a world state, but the logic of his argument leads him inescapably in that view, in that vein. The idea underlying perpetual peace is that human life as such, human life independent, that is, of the kind of life one leads, is an absolute good. Such an idea, I think, can only lead in the long run to moral decay. That is to say, to a kind of inability or unwillingness to dedicate one's life to ideals, to the relatively few things that give life wholeness and meaning. The cosmopolitan state would be, the world state would be the home of what Nietzsche called the last man. A world where nothing really matters, where there is nothing really of importance left to do, a world of entertainments, a world of fun, a world void of moral seriousness. So these two extremes, nationalism and cosmopolitanism, are today the two doctrines or tendencies that tend to obscure the true nature of the political. Each of these extremes contains, at best, a part of the truth, a partial truth. The nationalist is surely correct in some respect to see that politics is always a matter of the particular states, particular nations, particular peoples and traditions. For the nationalist, the particular stands for something infinitely higher and more noble than the cosmopolitan or the universal. We enter the world as members of a particular family, in a particular neighborhood, in a particular state, in a particular part of the country, and so on. We are a composite of particularities. And these attachments, these particularities, are not something extraneous or accidental to our identities. They are what make us who we are. The demand that we give up our particular identities and assume a kind of cosmopolitan point of view would be the same thing to ask us, at least to those who are native English speakers, to give up speaking English and adopt Esperanto, the artificial false language. I would ask, who is the Shakespeare or Milton of Esperanto? In other words, everything great derives from something rooted and particular. This is the morality of what you might call common ties. But there is also some truth on the cosmopolitan side. On the other hand, are we simply determined or condemned by the accident of birth to live by the traditions of the particular nation in which we happen to have been born? Doesn't this deny what seems to be highest in us, that is to say, our capacity for choice, to detach ourselves from our surroundings, to determine for ourselves how we will live and who we will be? This idea of choice, of being able to choose for oneself, is, I think, at the bottom of our experience of human dignity. We experience our moral worth as human beings through our ability to choose how we will live, with whom to live, and under what conditions. This kind of ideal, this cosmopolitan ethic, has the virtue of allowing us to stand outside of our particular situation and view ourselves from what you might call the standpoint of the disinterested spectator, from a higher or more general point of view. And clearly such a morality gives us a kind of critical distance or vantage point on how we can judge ourselves and our society. From this point of view, our local and particular attachment to family, friends, fellow citizens, again, carries no overwhelming moral weight. We must view them as we would view anyone or anything else, disinterestedly, objectively, and this one might call the morality of cosmopolitanism. Each of these ethics, the ethic of communal ties, the ethic of cosmopolitan individualism, express, again, an important piece of the truth of politics, although neither is alone complete in itself. How to combine them, or what should we do? In many respects, I think these two ethics, these two forms of ethos, are very much combined already in the American regime and how the American way of life should be properly understood. Consider the following. The American regime is the first truly modern nation, that is to say, a nation founded upon the principles of modern philosophy. Our founding document, the Charter of American Liberties, the Declaration of Independence, is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It is fair to say that the American regime requires more than loyalty. That is to say, it requires understanding. It requires understanding of that founding principle or that proposition and the various texts and debates in which that proposition was later articulated, as well as the range of responses and alternatives to it. To believe, for example, as you all now know, to believe that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights requires us to consider the opposite proposition contained in books like Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, that believed that human beings